All right, one last area that we need to take a look at, and that is the area that is talked about in terms of the self. And the self is probably one of Western psychology's most intensely researched topic. And underlying this research is the assumption that the self, as an organizer of thoughts, feelings, and actions, is the center of personality. So when we talk about myself, I'm talking about the center of my personality, which would include obviously thoughts, feelings, behaviors, just to name a few. And you could probably throw in motives here as well. What's interesting is that when we talk about the self, from a biblical point of view, oftentimes it is very synonymous for what the Bible refers to as the heart. And of course, God has some significant things to say about the human heart, but the heart isn't the organ that beats in my chest. It is the center or the seat of motives and thoughts and decisions and all of these things that are included in the modern day concept of self. One example of the research is looking at the idea of possible selves, and that really does have an impact on how I see me, how I see myself, and it explores people's visions of the self they dream of becoming. And this goes back to some of what Rogers was talking about when he talked about the ideal and the real self that comes into play when we're talking about that and the research that has to do with that. Another study that comes into play when we're talking about the research of looking at the self is something that's referred to as the spotlight effect. And essentially, the way to understand this is, let's just say for a minute that you're going out to a nice dinner with your family, and you're in a restaurant that has this beautifully varnished wood floor in it, and you're talking to one of your family members and getting very passionate in your movements with your hands and so forth, and suddenly you knock over your glass of water and onto the floor it clatters with all of the silverware and everything else, and you're positive that everyone's attention is focused on you. In adolescence, we referred to this as the imaginary audience. And that's what this spotlight effect is that it reflects our tendency to overestimate other people's attention in terms of our appearance, our behavior, our performance. All of that is part of how we see ourselves. Okay, and when you listen to me speak, notice how much of my language is actually shot through with the language of self. And so our tendency is to overestimate the attention we gain from people. So, you get a haircut and you're sure that the person who did your haircut did an outstanding job. You look really good, and you go out into public or you walk around on campus and not a single person even notices that you've had a haircut. Well, that's a good example, or a hairstyle, whatever you want to call it. But that's a good example of the spotlight effect. It has an impact on how we see ourselves. And one social psychologist called it the looking glass self, where we determine how we see ourselves as seen through other people's eyes. And that has an impact on how we understand ourselves and so forth. So each of those are really quite key. The idea, the natural other idea that comes into play here is the whole idea of self-esteem and what part it plays in terms of how we see ourselves, whether that's high or low, and how we persist in difficult tasks, how we see ourselves in terms of other people, and the actual impact it has, even on something as profound as aggressiveness. Just having a high self-esteem is not necessarily guarantee of feeling good about oneself. As a matter of fact, the higher one's self-esteem is, the more difficult it is to handle feedback on regarding myself, and that's usually when it ends up turning into aggressiveness. A couple other concepts that are important: self-serving bias. My tendency is always going to be in service to preserving myself and my particular view of myself. So this is our readiness to perceive ourselves favorably, and it's evident in our tendency to accept more responsibility for things that go good and less for things that go poorly or bad. And we tend to accept accolades when we do something well, and we tend to deflect when we do something badly. In other words, deflect responsibility to someone else when we do something badly. And that's all in service to what we're referring to here as the self-serving bias. The other thing, the other concept that falls into play when we're talking about the self and the study of the self is the idea of narcissism. And a lot of people really don't understand this term very well. Actually, it's founded in Greek mythology. Narcissus was a god, a Greek god, who wandered into the forest and saw himself in a pool of water, his reflection in the pool of water, and basically fell in love with himself and never left the pool because he was in such love with himself. And so we see, and I have certainly seen it even in politics and other places, is a high degree of narcissism, which is basically excessive self-love and a sense of entitlement that is embedded in it. And the entitlement is, I'm entitled to your attention and your accolades, no matter what I do. And so two different concepts that flow out of this is referred to as the defensive self-esteem and the secure self-esteem. And essentially for people that have a defensive self-esteem, they focus on sustaining itself, making failure and criticism feel threatening, and therefore they keep everybody on their heels, versus the secure self-esteem, where I cultivate a realistic understanding of myself. I can manage and take in negative feedback as well as positive feedback, and ultimately I don't believe the news clippings on either side of the continuum. That doesn't mean I'm not open to feedback. Secure self-esteem people can take feedback and leverage it into growth. In terms of people who have a defensive self-esteem, they do not take feedback, and feedback is basically seen as a threat, and therefore it impedes growth, because their perspective on themselves is all that matters, essentially. And that's part of the backdrop to what we're talking about when we talk about the self and the study of the self.